King Xerxes, also known as Ahasuerus, was one of the most powerful men in the world. In the 3rd year of his reign he invited the nobles and princes to a feast, which lasted 180 days. King Xerxes ruled over the empire of the Medes and Persians, which stretched over 127 provinces from Ethiopia to India. Living in his empire were many Jews. After the feast the king invited everyone at his palace in Susa, Shushan, to another feast which lasted 7 days. There were white, green and blue hangings fastened with fine linen cord to silver rings. There were beds of silver and gold on pavements of red, blue, black and white marble. Everyone drank from cups of gold. Queen Vashti gave a party for the women in another part of the palace. At the end of the 7 days the king, who was drunk, ordered his 7 servants to fetch Queen Vashti so he could show off her beauty. But they reported back that the queen refused to join him. The king was furious. His wise men advised him saying,
"The queen has not only insulted you but everyone. She has set a bad example in not showing honor to her husband."
The queen's title and estate was taken away from her. A law was made and read aloud throughout the land that all wives must honor and obey their husbands. Who would replace Vashti as queen? A search took place throughout the land for the most beautiful young women and they were brought to the palace under the supervision of Hegai, the king's servant. Working in the palace was a Jew called Mordecai. Mordecai had a cousin named Esther, also known as Hadassah, whom he had brought up because her parents had died. Esther was a beautiful young girl and chosen to join the other contestants at the palace for 12 months of beauty treatments. Mordecai advised her not to tell anyone she was a Jew. Of the many women chosen, Esther was the one the king loved most and she was crowned as queen instead of Vashti. A feast was given in her honor. But she told no one she was a Jew. A little while later Mordecai was guarding the king's gate and overheard 2 servants, Bigthan and Teresh, plotting against the king. Mordecai immediately warned Esther of the plot and she told the king. The 2 plotters were arrested, found guilty and hung on a tree. Their plot was recorded in the chronicles of the king's reign where it was noted that Mordecai had uncovered the plot. The king promoted Haman above all the other princes to be the 2nd most powerful man in the kingdom. All the servants working at the king's gate would bow to Haman when he entered. However, Mordecai would not bow before Haman or show him reverence. "Why do you break the king's command and not bow down and honor Haman?" the servants asked. They knew Mordecai was a Jew. They kept asking him but Mordecai would not listen to them. They reported the matter to Haman who was furious to find Mordecai the Jew did not bow or revere him. Haman schemed to find a way to punish not only Mordecai, but his people the Jews also. Haman went to the king and said,
"There are people living in the land who have their own laws and obey them rather than the king's commands. A law must be passed so they can be destroyed. I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's treasury to get this done."
The king took off his signet ring and gave it to Haman.
"Keep the money and do to these people what you think is best."
The king's scribes were instructed to write a law that on the 13th day of the 12th month the Jews were to be attacked and killed and their possessions taken as plunder. The law was sealed with the king's ring. A law of the Medes and Persians could not be changed or altered. The new law was announced throughout the empire. When the Jews heard the law of the Medes and Persians to have them killed on the 13th day of the 12th month, they started weeping and wailing. Many put on sackcloth and ashes as a sign of mourning. When Mordecai heard of Haman's plan to kill the Jews he tore his clothes, put on sackcloth and ashes and went around the city wailing loudly and bitterly. When Esther heard about Mordecai's distress, she sent Hathach, one of the king's servants, with clothes for him to put on instead of the sackcloth. But he refused to put them on. Hathach was sent again by Esther to find out what was troubling Mordecai. Mordecai gave Hathach the text of the new law and explained how much Haman had promised to pay into the treasury to destroy the Jews. He asked Hathach to tell Esther to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him to save her people, the Jews. Hathach reported back to Esther,
"Anyone who approaches the king's inner chamber without being summoned by the king is put to death, unless the king extends his golden scepter to them and spares their life. I have not been summoned by the king for 30 days.
Esther's words were reported back to Mordecai. He sent her back this message.
"Don't think because you live in the palace you alone of all the Jews will escape. If you remain silent the Jews will perish. Who knows, but you have been chosen as queen to help us at this time."
Esther sent a reply to Mordecai.
"Gather all the Jews in Susa to pray and fast for me. Don't eat for 3 days. I will pray and fast with you. Then I will go to the king even though he has not summoned me. If I die, I die."
On the third day Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. When the king saw her, he was pleased and held out his golden scepter to spare her life.
What is your request?
He asked.
Even if you ask for up to half the kingdom, I will give it to you.
I would like to invite the king and Haman to a special banquet I have prepared.
Esther replied. So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared.
What is your request?
The king asked.
I would like to invite the king and Haman to another banquet tomorrow. Then I will answer the king's question.
Haman left the palace in a good mood, but when he saw that Mordecai had not bowed or shown him respect, he was full of rage. Haman went to his friends and Zeresh his wife and boasted to them about his great wealth, his many sons, and the ways the king had honored him.
I have been invited to a banquet by the king and queen tomorrow. But I cannot be happy while Mordecai the Jew is sitting at the king's gate.
His wife and friends had an idea.
Have a pole set up.
And in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai impaled on it.
The suggestion delighted Haman, and he erected a pole that was 75 feet, 23 meters, high. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the chronicles of his reign to be brought in and read to him. When the king was read how Mordecai had exposed the plot to kill him, he asked,
What honor was given to Mordecai for doing this?
The attendants replied,
Nothing has been done.
Who is in the royal court?
The king asked.
Haman is standing in the court.
They replied. He had come to ask for Mordecai to be executed by being impaled on the pole he had erected.
Bring Haman in.
The king ordered. The king asked Haman,
What should be done for a man the king wants to honor?
Thinking that the king wanted to honor him, Haman replied,
Put the man in a royal robe the king has worn and on a horse the king has ridden.
Then get the king's most noble prince to lead the horse through the city proclaiming, This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor. Go at once and get the robe and horse.
The king commanded.
And then do as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the gate. Do not neglect any detail.
So Haman had to robe Mordecai, put him on a horse and led him through the city proclaiming,
This is what is done for the man the king honors.
A humiliated Haman rushed home in grief and reported what had happened to his wife and friends.
Since Mordecai the Jew has begun your downfall, you cannot stand against him.
They replied,
You will come to ruin.
At that moment the king's servant arrived to take Haman to the banquet Esther had prepared for him and the king. Haman was summoned to attend the banquet Queen Esther had prepared for him and the king. As they were drinking wine, the king asked,
What is it your request? Even if is half of my kingdom it will be granted.
My request is that you save my life and the lives of my people.
Esther replied.
We are to be destroyed.
Who has dared to threaten your life?
The king demanded to know.
An enemy,
Replied Esther.
this vile Haman.
Haman looked terrified. The king got up in a rage and went out into the palace garden. Haman started begging Esther to save his life. The king returned to find Haman falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. Guards were called to seize Haman. One of the king's attendants reported,
Haman has erected a pole by his house. He was planning to impale Mordecai on it.
Impale Haman on it.
The king ordered. Haman was led out to be executed. Then the king's fury subsided. That day the king gave Esther Haman's estate. Esther told the king she was related to Mordecai. The king gave Mordecai Haman's signet ring and Esther appointed him to look after Haman's riches and possessions. Esther fell at the king's feet weeping and begging him to put a stop to the evil plan to kill the Jews.
If it pleases the king, let an order be written overruling Haman's plan.
As Haman threatened the Jews, I have impaled him on the pole he set up.
The king replied,
But the documents, which written in my name, cannot be changed. Therefore, write another decree in my name, which is help for you and your people, and sealed with my signet ring.
The royal secretaries were summoned. A new law was written giving the Jews the right to gather and defend themselves if anyone attacked them. They could also plunder the properties of their enemies. Copies of the new law were sent out through the 127 provinces of the empire. Everyone knew the Jews would be ready and waiting if anyone attacked them on the 13th day of the 12th month. When Mordecai left the palace, he was wearing a royal purple robe and crown. The Jews celebrated the news and their enemies became afraid of them. The 13th day of the 12th month was the date the enemies of the Jews hoped to destroy them. The Jews gathered to defend themselves, helped by the governors and nobles of the provinces. Any group who attacked them were struck down and killed. In the capital city of Susa, Haman's 10 sons and another 500 men, who hated the Jews, were destroyed. But the Jews did not plunder their belongings. Permission was given to the Jews to continue dealing with their enemies the next day also. In the provinces, 75,000 of those who planned to destroy the Jews were annihilated. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews asking them to celebrate this victory every year on the 14th and 15th days of the 12th month. Haman had plotted and cast a lot, known as a Purim, to destroy the Jews. So the celebration was called the Feast of Purim. It was a day of feasting and joy. People gave presents to each other. The Jews have kept this custom every year, through every generation, to this very day.